Breaking news. The Canon R6 Mark II specs have leaked in full, and they're gonna rock your world. I'll tell you about it in just a second, but first I want to thank our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is your personal home on the web for your photography, for your video, for your business, or your personal project. Head to squarespace.com/Tony today. Try it out completely free. Set up a store, take appointments from clients. We just use our Squarespace to send proofs to clients so they could pick which of the senior photos they wanted. Squarespace is perfect, inexpensive, and so simple to set up. Again, squarespace.com/Tony. And when you love it, the coupon code Tony gets you 10% off after your free trial. And thanks to Canonrumors.com for this information. They give us a CR3, which is basically like fact. These seem to be legitimate. And the first spec is that it's going to be very similar in form factor to the existing Canon EOS R6, which I'm okay with, though a lot of people are upset that it wouldn't have a top screen. And I agree, especially since I've been using Sony cameras as my main cameras. I really miss having a top screen to get the settings dialed in without having to look at the rear screen, especially since the less expensive Canon R had a top screen. Oh, apparently there's a correction. Hand me that. Oh my God, the source that said this was going to rock your world was incorrect. Apparently it's not even going to rock your boat. Is it gonna rock their Casbahs? It's not gonna rock their anything. Okay, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, here are the specs. It's going to be a 24 megapixel full frame camera. Now, that's actually a big upgrade from the existing camera, which only has 20 megapixels. And I'll add, those 20 megapixels have a very heavy AA filter in our testing, and thus the images coming out of the existing R6 are pretty low res. Now, a lot of people are finding that it is just fine, and in fact, you don't need a lot of resolution for a lot of things like Instagram or like video. But when I recently did my full Canon comparison and I compared the images with this and an expensive lens versus the Canon R5 and a cheap lens, the 45 megapixel R5 with a cheap lens always produced significantly better results than this with a very expensive lens. In the past, we've compared 20 to 24 megapixel cameras, and that is a significant difference. That 20% with current lenses makes a visible difference in image quality. So this will be a worthwhile upgrade. But the fact is the Canon R3 also has a 24 megapixel sensor, and that makes me wonder if it might be the same sensor. And that is still undecided, but that would be big news because the Canon R3 has a stacked CMOS sensor, which has a very fast readout speed, basically eliminating the need to use the mechanical shutter for things like action. Right now, the 20 megapixels on the R6, if you put it in silent mode, shoot with the electronic shutter, you get 20 frames per second. But if you're trying to shoot a golf game silently, everybody's golf clubs are going to be all warpy. You'll get banding under artificial light too. So a lot of sports shooters have found the electronic shutter is essentially unusable and they have to use the mechanical shutter, which lowers the frames per second to 12 frames per second. Still respectable. But if it did get that sensor from the R3, this would be a great upgrade. If it does not, if it is a regular non-stacked 24 megapixel sensor, then it's not that exciting and will probably still have some banding and rolling shutter. Some other specs, the mechanical frames per second is still 12 frames per second. That has not changed. I would guess the electronic shutter with 20 frames per second is going to stay the same too. It will still do full width 4K at 30 frames per second, but when you shoot 4K at 60 frames per second, which is our normal out of the studio resolution, there's going to be a heavier crop. And they're not specific about that. The existing R6 has a little bit of a crop, a 1.1 times crop, and that wasn't enough to bother me. We used the R6 as our main video camera for years shooting 4K 60. The only reason we stopped is it overheated a couple of times and ruined our shoot, and then I switched back to the Sony a7S III. But if you suddenly had to use a 1.5 times crop or any kind of heavier crop than that, I probably wouldn't recommend that as an A camera for 4K 60 shooters. So that could kind of be a big deal, and it does suck when there's an upgrade that also comes with some downgraded features. This makes sense though, because as we do increase the number of megapixels, the camera's processors would need to be processing and combining more pixels in order to read from the full pixel width. That's why cameras like the Sony a7S III only have 12 megapixels. They can do a full sensor readout very easily. It does not overheat. It does not wear down the battery as fast. More megapixels makes video much more difficult. So it could be a bit of a trade-off. Just like the R6, it'll have sensor stabilization and 2 SD card slots. There's no mention of it on Canonrumors, but I would guess Canon is going to eliminate the 30-minute recording limit in the R6. In the past, Canon's given us an artificial 30-minute recording limit to reduce the cannibalization of their cinema cameras. They seem to be more concerned about competition from Sony now, who does not have that same recording limit, so I think they're lifting that limit across the board. Now, of course, they could give this to us in a firmware update for all of their cameras, but they don't seem to be doing that. And I hope they've eliminated the overheating problem, which was why we stopped using it as our main video camera. If you are any kind of video shooter and suddenly the camera overheats and can't shoot again for 10 minutes, like you can imagine having actors or your family or your kid's sports game and suddenly you can't film it, a wedding. No, those are all absolute deal breakers. Whether you're a professional or an amateur, you need a reliable tool that can keep up with you, so hopefully they fix that. Now, there are some other specs in there which were a little confusing. One was a digital teleconverter, and I haven't seen that term before, but I have seen something similar in other cameras where it simply crops in and gives you that angle of view in the viewfinder. My guess is they're giving us crops equivalent to traditional teleconverter crops, which are 1.4 times or 2 times. But we've always had 1.5 times, which was A-OK. Now, this can be useful to reduce the file sizes if you're shooting a faraway subject like a bird and your lens doesn't quite reach as much. Maybe they'll even give us a full frame field of view in the viewfinder with a little box and then crop down when you actually capture that picture. I remember the old D850 would do that. It was a full frame camera, but you could shoot in APS-C, but because it was a DSLR, you still had a full field of view, and that was so useful for wildlife because it meant I was capturing like 24 megapixel files, but just the center part, which is what I only ever needed for faraway subjects. They also talk about hybrid auto, and I was not familiar with this. I had to Google it, but apparently this is a feature that some Canon cameras have already had. Here's how it works. When you take a still picture, it will also record a 2 to 4 second video clip, and then at the end of the day, it will compile those video clips together into something that you might like share with your family. So this reminds me of the sort of live photos that you get on your iPhone or Pixel or Android, where it records a few seconds of video, combined with the memories features, where every now and then it puts your videos together and kind of shares it with you. I think that's what Canon is going for, but I don't really think that's something a lot of serious camera users are going to use. They also talk about having cloud RAW processing. This is a feature that's been out on a few cameras, like the Canon R3, the Canon R7, and the Canon R10. And the way this works is the camera will connect through Wi-Fi to Canon's image.canon cloud processing service. And then Canon is saying they will do better than normal RAW processing on these to reduce the noise and improve the sharpness. This doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, there's lots of companies now offering better than normal RAW processing, like On1 and Topaz will do this for you, and I think this is Canon's version of that, but Canon is the camera manufacturer. Like, if you can improve RAW processing, why don't you do that in camera with your JPEGs? Well, they're saying, I don't know, I guess it requires their big servers and artificial intelligence in order to do this, so you'll be able to take advantage of this. Here's the deal. I have tested image.canon with the Canon R3, which should be exactly equivalent to this in performance, and it was not usable. The camera does have Wi-Fi. It even has 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, but it still transferred so slowly, on the order of like 10 times slower than my iPhone did, that it was kind of unusable, especially for RAW files. And so as a result, I think they need to work on their internal radios. Now, the fact is, Canon, like other camera manufacturers, they basically have to write like bare metal drivers for their radios. And that probably won't make sense to you if you're not a developer, but because they're not using a modern operating system like Android, it means that it takes a lot of work to optimize the performance of a camera with a bunch of different wireless access points that are out there, and performance is probably always going to suck. And thus, the Canon Cloud RAW processing might not actually be usable, but subscribe for our full review, because as soon as it comes out and we can get our hands on one, we will test that out. The specs also say that it will take RF and RFS lenses, and I had never tried this before, but I did put an RFS and APS-C lens on our Canon R6, and it works just fine. I was surprised by this because the R6 predates Canon's APS-C cameras, But that means that the Canon developers were planning ahead and knew how to detect an APS-C lens and crop accordingly. So that's not a new feature. There's no mention of this, but I think Canon's going to want to talk about better autofocus because that is the primary aspect driving people to upgrade nowadays. So how are they going to meet that? One distinct possibility is they're going to finally include quad pixel AF. Right now, these cameras all have dual pixel autofocus, but as a result, when focusing on horizontal lines, sometimes the camera doesn't autofocus well. And I've talked to a lot of sports shooters who find it misses focus more than, say, their Canon 1DX did, which had many different ways of autofocus and not just the sort of dual pixel autofocus. It's not a perfect system. Quad pixel promises to fix all that. So maybe this is going to be the camera that launches quad pixel autofocus. That'd be really exciting. I would also bet that they would include the controls from the Canon R7, the sort of new multi-dial, rather than just using the exact same Canon R6 body. Canon has been evolving their control scheme, starting with some weird choices in the original Canon R, and everyone's been a little bit different. So I hope they sort of lock that down so we get some more consistency between bodies, because so many photographers do have multiple cameras and switch between them for different purposes. Now, the Canon R6 Mark II is a little bit exciting, but what I'm really excited for is the replacement to the Canon R5. And the R5 and R6 were launched on the same day. So I kind of expected the replacements to be launched on the same day, but there are no rumors about the R5 Mark II. Now, the R5 Mark II doesn't necessarily need a replacement, but still, newer is always better, right? Let's compare the new R6 Mark II against the closest competition, starting with the Canon R6. I think the price is going to be the same at $2,500. The R6 has 24 megapixels, and I think it won't have a recording limit, but that's pretty much the highlight. Comparing the Canon R6 Mark II to the Nikon Z6 Mark II, they're very, very similar cameras. Nikon is going to win here for price, as the Z6 is priced at $2,000 and pretty much matches it feature by feature, even the 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. One advantage Nikon has is they can use third-party lenses, which Canon is blocking from their RF mirrorless system. However, Nikon does have a trick up their sleeve. They seem to be using Tamron lenses and branding them Nikon lenses and then adding $400 to the price. I'm going to have to make a full separate video sort of analyzing what's going on with Nikon. Now, compare the Canon R6 Mark II to the Sony a7 IV. I think the prices are going to be the same. I actually thought they might raise the price on the Canon R6 Mark II, but I thought, do they really feel like they can charge more than the Sony a7 IV, which is extremely popular and the most important competition for them, especially because the a7 IV has 33 megapixels, significantly more detail than you'll get out of a 24 megapixel sensor. But the a7 Mark IV is a little bit slower. They lock it in at only 10 frames per second with either the mechanical or the electronic shutter, and this will do 12 frames per second, which is an important difference for sports photographers, or up to 20 frames per second in silent mode with that rolling shutter. But the Sony a7 Mark IV can save you money in other ways, in that you have a lot of third-party mirrorless lenses designed for that system, a lot. Most photographers spend more on their lenses than their bodies, several times more, and those third-party lenses can save you 30 or 40%. So that could be a way bigger difference than any difference between the two bodies. In the comments down below, I'd like to hear what you think about the R6 Mark II. What do you hope to see? And are you interested in buying it? And subscribe to see our upcoming review of it. And don't forget to check out our sponsor, Squarespace, for any type of web presence. Get your own private domain. There was a guy who wanted me to use his driveway sealing business, and he handed me his business card, and he had gmail.com as his email address, and then no website for his business whatsoever. Just his business card, and I was supposed to email him. And it made me think that he didn't have a real business. It was enough for me to not use him. You may not think that way, but a lot of your customers do. Customers want to see an actual real web presence with your own private domain. They don't want to see gmail.com. That seems cheap and amateur. Go to squarespace.com/Tony. I promise you can set up a real website very easily, and it will have all the features that you can dream of. Try it out for free, no pressure. If you like it, the coupon code Tony will get you 10% off that website. Thank you for sponsoring us, Squarespace. Bye.